Welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and today's bad idea, as usually happens to me, Tony, is a big one that I had somehow never heard of before. Today, we're going to talk about the time in 1985 when the Philadelphia police dropped a bomb on Philadelphia.
I think I've heard of this a little bit, but it was like a side note on some other strange podcast. I'm very curious about this.
So, this incident is going to happen in 1985, but we have to back up quite a bit to get the context of how and why this happened. The central figure in our story today is going to be a man named Vincent Leapart. I think it's pronounced Leapart. It could also be Leafart. And Vincent Leapart was an African-American gentleman who was born in 1931. And he grew up in a school system that he was not well equipped to thrive in. For one reason or another, he struggled pretty badly in school, and they gave him an IQ test, and he tested somewhere between 70 and 80 on the IQ scale. He was pronounced functionally illiterate. He was sent to a trade school where he didn't do much attending, and he eventually made it to adulthood with only the barest bones of an education. After he was failed by the education system, he went off to Korea to fight in that war, and it seems like he started to think about things a little bit differently when he was in Korea. He saw the beauty of the countryside and the sunset and the world around him and the contrast that it made with the evils of men and the killing that was being done. And he comes home in the 60s thinking arguably in a way that a lot of people were thinking in the 60s, thinking about peace and the way that life could be preserved and made better for man. In 1970, he makes his way to a co-op in Powelton, Pennsylvania. And this is kind of a typical hippie late 60s, early 70s place. There's a lot of free thinkers there. They're not really so much about hierarchy. Like, they have a charter that says nobody's allowed to have any hierarchy. They're helping each other out with the rent. It's kind of a commune type of a situation. And he meets...
Sounds like a commune with slightly less commitment involved.
Yes.
Still a nice place, though.
It seems like the kind of thing that if you were the sort of, I want more of my freedoms, I want to think differently, I want to not be part of the establishment, that you could go here and have a reasonably good life and sort of be able to express your ideas pretty well. And Vincent Leapart goes around talking about his ideas that he has about the world. And he meets a man named Donald Glassy. And Donald Glassy is really fascinated by Vincent Leapart. He kind of becomes a friend of his, and he starts writing down these things that Vincent is saying. He's fascinated by his outlook on life, his philosophy. And so he creates essentially a book of Vincent's sayings. And this book would come to be known as the Guidelines. This is Vincent Leapart's Bible, in essence. And Vincent Leapart starts to accumulate more followers. Donald Glassy was the first, but there are more and more people who come to him, and he founds an organization that eventually comes to be named MOVE. It's stylized in all caps, MOVE. It was originally the American Christian Movement for Progress or something along those lines, but Vincent Leapart, despite his apparently tested low IQ, has a kind of knack for understanding what influences people, and MOVE is a much more powerful name than the American Christian Institute for whatever
Yeah, ACFP versus just being able to turn it into, like, an action word.
Yes, it's not an acronym. It doesn't stand for anything. It's all caps, so it's just got that, like, punch to it. And move becomes something of a movement. Not a large movement, but it collects people who are down on their luck and who are having trouble with drugs. And you would understand that there would be quite a few people that this type of person would come in contact with, because he's in contact with the hippie culture, with the drug culture. He's an African-American man, so he's in contact with the lower classes in a way that other people might not be. And he brings these people into his movement and starts teaching them his ways. And he, from at least some accounts, seems to have done some good in these people's lives. There are people who are on drugs when they meet Vincent Leapart, and he helps them get off drugs. He has this diet plan that he promotes that is involving raw foods, and he has this back to nature approach and extreme pro-life type of philosophy that he
Part of me
preaches.
is wondering if this is like the difference between intelligence and wisdom, where he's able to, like, he might not be great at pattern recognition, but he actually has some wisdom in him, or if this is something where he was not motivated to take an IQ test at the time, that maybe Korea, like, made him wake up a little bit to his own abilities. It seems like there's a lot more to him than just a, like, comfortable Fahrenheit level score of IQ.
Well, I don't want to attribute wisdom to John Africa, Tony, because I've kind of been giving the all positive side of this, but I do think if there is such a thing as emotional intelligence of interactive IQ, John Africa is amazing at this. He is great at manipulation, for better and for worse, as we're going to find out. Because there was a dark side to move. As part of their anti-establishment hatred of the system, thinking that people had been programmed to be evil and hateful towards each other, they forbade that their children be allowed to go to school or even be taught to read or write.
That is horrific. Like, I know he's functionally illiterate, but why would you keep that from kids?
If you believe that reading and writing are part of this system that has caused all of the pain in life, it's not that difficult to extrapolate forward. Oh, we'll just stop kids from taking part of that, and then they'll be peaceful and happy. And I'd like to point out, Move exists today, and they still at least object to formal schooling on their public facing websites and things like that. They do not, they say, send their children to school. I do not know if they refuse to teach them to read at this point, or if that's something that they've let go by the wayside, but there is still a very anti-establishment stance from this group.
It seems like such a self-defeating way of making your group limited, though, too. If you stop kids from being able to read, you're slowing down their ability to spread information, and it kind of makes it like a 1 or 2 generation thing instead of a life, like a multiple generation movement. You gotta have that sort of communication to keep that alive.
Well, we'll see. I guess we would find out in the next 50 years or so if they are able to continue or if they die out. But we're still with Vincent at this point. And another thing that he does, I mentioned earlier that he takes a extreme pro-life approach. I realize that that's a term that is often used to apply to whether you're for abortion or not. That is not what I'm referring to. When I say he's extremely pro-life, I mean Vincent doesn't believe in killing anything. And not only does he not believe in killing anything, he believes in encouraging all forms of life, including many kinds of vermin and bugs that people might not particularly find tasteful to have around their homes.
So it's just all about those roaches and everything.
roaches and rats become a problem. Vincent starts leaving raw meat and bones out in front of his dwelling place for dogs to come and eat, and there are other animals that come and get into these leavings, and they start affecting the rest of the co-op where he is still living. Now, around this time, Vincent has started to restyle himself. He has become the leader of this movement, and he changes his name from Vincent Leaphart to John Africa. Africa, he says, not necessarily because he is an African-American man, but because it is the cradle of all life on Earth, and he is, again, very much about the spread of life. And he builds this mythos about himself. He really essentially disappears as Vincent Leaphart and reemerges as John Africa, as this new messianic figure for the Move members. While he's doing this, the co-op around him is becoming divided by his presence. The people who are living in close proximity to him are, I would argue, understandably annoyed and frustrated by the rats and the stray dogs and the cockroaches that are now festering in his dwelling place.
Yeah, it's like you're supposed to love life and everything, but even you'll occasionally catch Buddhist monks with a can of Raid to keep that sort of stuff out.
They literally would argue against Raid. They would say no. I don't know if it was the exact name brand, but they objected pretty violently to the idea that you would spray any kind of cockroach spray around your house. And the cockroaches obviously don't just stay on his property. They're spreading out to people around him. And so some of the Move members are like, this is gross and unsanitary and we don't like it. But the other members of the co-op, not necessarily Move members, but the other people in the co-op turn to these people who are complaining about the roaches and the rats, and they say, you are just racist. How dare you talk about John Africa like that? This man who is clearly making such a great difference in the lives of so many people. You just can't you deal with like a couple of rats and cockroaches? My goodness. And John Africa manages to split this co-op, which bought him a house, by the way. He was not able to afford the house he was living in, and the co-op paid for the house to belong to him. He splits this thing right down the middle as Move continues to grow under his watchful eye.
It's bizarre, but that's cult leaders.
It is very much like a cult. And another thing that cults tend to do is they tend to get paranoid. They tend to think somebody's coming for them, and they, in this particular instance, began to amass guns and materials to make bombs with.
Sounds like him and David Koresh would be very good friends.
It is interesting to me because on the one hand, there is a arguable race angle to this. This is a black man we're talking about, and many, although not all of his followers were also black. But as you dig down into the story, it's not that black and white, and I don't intend that to be a pun or anything, because he really does have a lot of the same types of things going on that other cult leaders of other races have faced in America. He has the same kinds of paranoia, and he has the same kinds of government opposition that many of those cult leaders have. Once you get to a certain size and a certain level of, I believe we should tear everything down and replace it with whatever I say, the government, you know, the thing you're trying to tear down, they're going to take notice, no matter what color you are. I'm not saying there's no racism involved here, because I certainly can't see into anybody's minds or hearts, but it's a nuanced situation.
It's also like during the middle of the civil rights movement if it's the mid-60s.
Now, Move is attempting, at least in their minds, to be a force for good. So they do things like you would expect a group like this might do. They protest outside the zoo. They protest outside of pet stores. They go to the police station and protest there. They're doing sort of typical activist group kind of stuff, in addition to also collecting weapons and bomb-making materials, and even, in one source I read, attempting to get their hands on a bazooka.
That's another level upward. And once again, reminds me of Waco.
Yes. And so the ATF sort of notices what's going on here. And they actually get involved with Donald Glassy. Donald Glassy, who had been John Africa's first disciple, is really becoming disillusioned with everything that's going on. You know, he thought that this guy had some interesting ideas at first, and he's the one who wrote them all down. And now he's walking around with this guy and the people who follow him, just seeing guns lined up in rows on tables and thinking to himself, this is not what I'm here for at all. I wanted peace and love, and this is really starting to look dangerous. And so the ATF comes to him and says, hey, can you help us out? Can you give us info? And he helps them out at some danger to his own life, I would add, because the MOVE people start noticing that things are getting a little tighter and they start suspecting him. But he works with the ATF as much as possible to collect evidence, to get these weapons out of MOVE's hands. And several people are arrested in this ATF sting that is trying to take down this bomb-making operation. There follows a bit of a standoff. I was not able to get a clear picture of what happens between 1977 and 1978, but the cops are still watching MOVE. And when I say watching, I mean at any point in time during this about 10-month period, it seems like there are 100, on average, undercover policemen just sort of hanging around, waiting to arrest some of the people that they think are in connection with this bomb-making and illegal firearms potentially collecting operation.
That's a lot of resources for a police department.
The number that I saw was $1.2 million for this 10-month period.
1970s money, so it's like, that's a lot of money.
And all of this culminates in a shootout in 1978 where a police officer is killed. Now, the facts of this death are disputed, and I was not there, nor was I at the trial. The MOVE people claim that their guns at the time were inoperable and that he was shot in the back of the neck by an accidental firing from one of the people on his own side. I can see that being certainly potentially possible. I can also see it being the thing that you would say if you wanted to get out of going to jail. I don't know what happened, but I do know that 9 MOVE members went to prison for a very long time relating to this man's death.
Do you know how big MOVE is at this point? Like, how many people?
My guess is between 50 and 100. It's not huge. We're not talking about, massive numbers of thousands of people following John Africa around. It's able to be contained within a few houses around the city of Philadelphia. Yeah.
There's a lot more of these micro cults than people realize. Like, if you look back at Heaven's Gate and Marshall Applewhite, his stuff was about this size. And over the course of history, like, there's just been a ton where people get trapped into these sub 300 level mini cults. Like, this one might not have a sort of religious ethos behind it, but it's kind of like NXIVM, where there's a unifying force and a person directly at the top that seems to have grabbed them.
There is religious-esque stuff going on. They're definitely talking about nature and God and spirits and cycling to the next life. They talk about death as the cycle, which is fine until they start using it as a verb. Like, should I cycle this person? Then it's extra creepy.
Yeah, that's a pretty good euphemism.
In both of these actions taken against MOVE, John Africa was either through luck or cleverness, and I'm inclined to give him the cleverness argument here, not present at the time when everything kicks off. He escapes despite the fact that there are warrants out for his arrest, and he moves under an assumed name to Rochester, New York. And in Rochester, New York, he buys up some cheap property, several cheap houses in a neighborhood, and starts converting them, as he did many of his other places, to move strongholds. They are fortified. The front porches are ripped off. There is stuff done to the front yards that makes it more likely for vermin to come out. However, at first at least, it's not that bad because he moves up there in the dead of winter and, you know, there's not a lot of cockroaches and rats outside in the New York winter. And he's relatively well liked by some of his neighbors. And they follow a pattern that you might recognize if you listen to our episode about the People's Temple. They are very much about helping out around the neighborhood. It's snowing in Rochester, New York at this time, and they go around and shovel the entire streets, sidewalks, and driveways without being asked or paid. And that's a good way to get people on your side. If you want,
yeah, it's just like little acts of kindness can go a long way to get people to like on your side PR wise. And sometimes I'm sure these people felt like they were being sincere, that they wanted to help.
I would not take that from them, Tony. I think that that's probably likely. However, again, there is a division in the neighborhood about how people should feel about this. Some people like these new, weird, quirky neighbors. They say, oh, wow, we've got, you know, some diversity finally, and these people are working hard to, you know, make things better. But other people say, yeah, but they like tore up their house and nailed slats all over the windows. And I mean, that used to be a real nice house, and they're putting stuff out in the front yard like raw meat, and are they smearing feces on the grass? What's up with that? I see rats, more and more rats coming in every day. And once again, John Africa is not necessarily universally welcomed in his neighborhood. However, before things get much worse, the police finally catch up with him. John Africa is arrested, and he's taken to trial back in Philadelphia. He has mountains of evidence against him. There is so much evidence in this case that they aren't able to bring it all to the courtroom. Like, they don't file all the evidence they have because there's just so much of it that they can't complete the paperwork to get it all on the record for the trial. However, John mounts an amazing defense. First off, his lawyers bring up person after person after person who does the character witness thing, who says, listen, I was on drugs, John helped me out. I was on the street, John gave me a home. I was without any hope at all, and John was there for me. And they paint him as this really beautiful person. And John himself gets up in the final closing moments of the trial and gives this impassioned speech to the jury, talks about how he's essentially misunderstood, that all he's doing is trying to defend himself, and the jury goes away for 6 days and comes back with a not guilty verdict.
6 days is a pretty hefty time for deliberation. It's like that's definitely some sowing of doubt in there.
The lawyer who was trying to prosecute John Africa said after the trial, quote, "It was the only case I ever lost as a prosecutor. It was also the strongest case I ever had."
That's intense.
Yes. So you get a sense of the magnetism that this man is able to exude. The fact that not only is he able to help all these people in at least the ways that they see as help, for them to come up and give these glowing reports to him, but that he's able to go to the jury and essentially say, yeah, I know, I had a pile of guns and bomb-making materials in my house, but these guys are just picking on me. And get them to buy that? That's somebody to be reckoned with right there.
Yeah, that's some influence.
Now, John, after this, eventually moves back to Philadelphia, and he moves to 6221 Osage Avenue. Now, Osage Avenue is in a neighborhood that was, at the time, a middle-class black neighborhood. These were row houses, so all of these houses are built one right up on another, and it's a nice enough place. The pictures that I've seen of the area before the events that we're going to be talking about here in a minute paint it as relatively idyllic. It was not the kind of place where you'd be like, oh, I don't want to go there, it looks kind of sketchy. No, it's a nice place. These people are all relatively doing well in the world. We're not talking about a ghetto here. This is not the poor neighborhood of Philadelphia. It is a black neighborhood, but they're doing pretty well for themselves. And John Africa moves in, and in addition to the other stuff that we've already established that he does, which he continues to do here at Osage Avenue, he also, at a certain point in his residency in this house with his other Move members, builds on the roof of his house a loudspeaker through which, at all hours of the night, the Move members demand the release of the 9 people who were imprisoned after the first initial FBI sting. Now, the only people who can hear them are their black neighbors. And I don't really think race has much to do with the fact that everybody in this neighborhood who was being blasted throughout the night on a nightly basis for months on end with propaganda that they had nothing to do with started to get really, really annoyed with John Africa and the Move people.
I would be very, very annoyed too. It's like I get a little bit frustrated whenever I can hear my neighbors yelling or their TV too loud.
Exactly.
Much less a giant loudspeaker.
I mean, the time on a Saturday during the day when my neighbors across the street had a screaming match with each other, that was notable enough for me to be like, I still remember that. That was months and months ago, but like, that was a big deal. I've called the police on people who were having just a loud party, but, you know, at 3 o'clock at night when I want to sleep. And so you can understand why these people would say, hey, guys, calm down. We didn't do it. You guys need to be quiet. And when they say these things to the members of Move, they are threatened. Some of them are not like nobody gets killed, but there's some physical violence that goes on from the Move members to the other members of the community. And the other dynamic that I thought was really interesting, and this little anecdote appeared in, I think, just a couple of sources I was able to find, but there was this lady who talked about the kids from Move. One of the other things, in addition to not teaching their kids anything with reading and writing, they also believed that clothing was the tool of the man in some sense, and so generally these kids were kept naked or mostly naked, and they're running around the neighborhood. All of these Move people are supposed to eat only raw foods, but for whatever reason, these kids are still hungry. I don't want to venture too far into speculation, but the story is that these kids are digging in garbage cans looking for food to eat. And when the other neighbors realize that there's these kids who are digging around in garbage cans, some of them buy brand new clean garbage cans and start leaving bread in these garbage cans for the kids to eat, which infuriates some of the Move people even more and gets them yelling like, why are you interfering with how I'm trying to raise my kid?
It's because your kid can't get enough calories on all the apples you're giving them. Or like the carrots. It's just not enough calories, and like you're gonna have mineral deficiencies.
That is almost certainly the case, Tony. I would not recommend feeding your kids only raw foods. I am not a nutritionist, but I do know that these kids wanted more to eat. Now,
Yeah.
at the same time that all this is going on, Move is doing the fortification thing. They have gotten some railroad ties. They have got tree trunks from a nearby park, and they are lining the inside of their house with these thicker pieces of timber, as well as building what is described in every article I can find on the subject as a bunker on the top of their house. This is essentially a pillbox, a 6x6 kind of box. It's got holes you can stick rifles out of, but it's going to protect you from a lot of different calibers of gunfire anyway. And they build this on the roof of their, again, home in a relatively nice middle-class neighborhood.
I keep getting visions of certain parts of Fallout 4 with the row houses and like the sandbag and cover on top of them. Like, that's just what it feels like for this.
I mean, yes, that, but for only one house. Like, everything else is in the pre-bomb stage, and then this one house looks like, you know, it's the apocalypse and they're getting ready for invasion, which is about to come. Because the people of the neighborhood finally have enough. They've complained to the police, they've complained to the mayor, nothing has gotten done, and again, in the race angle of this, it's important to know that for most of this time, the mayor of the city is the first African-American mayor, Wilson Goode. He is the first African-American mayor of Philadelphia.
I'm sure he's not one to rock the boat too much with his constituents by like going after something like this. So he's in a pretty rough spot.
It's a dicey situation, but the people in the neighborhood, who again are also mostly black, they decide, fine, the mayor's not going to do anything, the police are not going to do anything, we're going to the governor. And they write this statement/letter to the governor saying, quote, "We are here to let the governor know about the disquietude and general state of terror we are forced to live under by the MOVE organization. We want the governor to know that regardless of whatever may have happened in the past, today, MOVE is a clear and present danger to the health and safety of our entire block. We also want the governor to know that we have been to our elected representatives in city and state government, but to date, nothing of any consequence has been done. We are now asking Governor Thornburg to step in and deal with this situation." And at this point, Mayor Wilson Goode really has no choice. They're going to go over his head anyway. It's going to become a national story. So he calls in the police and says, all right, come up with a plan to deal with these guys. The police come up with their plan. They go around the neighborhood to the nearby houses, by the MOVE house. They knock on the doors and say, guys, we're going to do something. But you guys should probably get out of here. 24 hours tops. You can leave. Go stay with somebody. You'll be back in 24. We'll take care of this. Don't worry about taking anything. It's going to be over and everything's going to be fine. Just give us our space to work. And people do this. They leave their houses and say, great, finally, somebody's going to do something about MOVE. The police then attempt to execute a search warrant on the MOVE people. They, with a bullhorn, read out a list of demands. They say, and among other things, this is America and you have to follow the rules, which in my opinion was probably not like the most likely thing to make them listen to you and say, oh, maybe they have a point, if they're kind of an anti-establishment, anti-government type of people anyway.
Yeah, that's just confirming their suspicions on how they're supposed to act, and that the forces of tyranny are coming after them.
Well, the forces of tyranny included 500 officers who were involved in this operation, who were armed with a variety of fully automatic weapons, including Uzis, Thompson submachine guns, and M16s. And when the shootout kicks off, because obviously the shootout kicks off, none of these people are particularly good at negotiation, unfortunately, there are 10,000 rounds fired at this house in a relatively short amount of time. And it does nothing.
So we're talking about, like, I'm trying to figure out the math on that. Every cop's just firing a few hundred rounds.
I mean, I didn't divide it out, Tony.
Like that.
You're welcome to do the actual math on 500 divided by 10,000. But it's substantial.
Yeah, it's like 200 rounds each.
They're also, at the same time, they have fire trucks on scene continuously pumping water over and into that bunker. So they're just spraying water from a vantage point relatively far away, trying to obscure the vision of the MOVE people. They're treating this as essentially a full-on urban assault. This is nothing short of an army trying to take down what is, I think, if my math is correct, something like 13 people in a house.
That is that's a massive overreaction. That's almost 1,000 rounds per person.
Well, I would agree with that, Tony, and I hope by now that you understand I am not on the side of Move. I think that they had a lot of problems, and many of these people probably deserved, quote unquote, to be arrested. There was probably some just reason to bring charges against them and to get them out of this neighborhood, but the way that this was done is not great. And it's about to get worse because this doesn't work, right? The full-on barrage of bullets does not work. Going down into the basement of the nearby house, drilling a hole through and putting tear gas into the basement does not work. In fact, the people who are there in the post-mortem, I saw a really good documentary. I think the Philadelphia Inquirer puts on a series of, not like a full documentary, but about 10 minutes of each of before, during, and after what happened in this. And it's a really well done. I think explores all the sides pretty fairly. One of the guys who's part of this breaching team in the basement says that Move had built a room within the room. So when they drilled through the wall, they were ready for mustard gas or tear gas to come in. And the kids were down there in the basement, but they had a wall built around them and they had wet blankets to hide under. And so they weren't able to breach their fortifications. So their next step, they've fired a bunch of rounds into these people. That did nothing. So now they decide to drop a bomb.
It seems illegal, but here we are.
Well, it's the police, and my understanding of this is that this was essentially a breaching charge, like you would put on a door, or maybe a lot of breaching charge that you would put on a bunch of doors. But the FBI has helped out the Philadelphia Police Department. They have given them this satchel of explosives that includes C4 and something called Tovex. And the police department flies a helicopter over the roof of the house. They set a 40-second timer. They drop this backpack on the roof of the house and they fly away. And the bomb explodes and almost nothing happens. Like, everybody feels it. I mean, people who didn't even evacuate talk about, man, the whole house got shook. But the fortifications that they were trying to blow up are not injured. The bunker is remaining. That was the main thing they were trying to get. They blow a hole in the roof, but it's not that big of a hole. Somebody might have been killed by this blast, but we're not able to tell because what happens next is the real problem in this story. Of all the other problems, believe me, I understand there are many.
Yeah, just dropping a bomb isn't quite enough for this particular story. And I think I know what's coming because I Googled some things about, like, what happens next.
Well, what happens next is that a gasoline can on the roof of this building catches fire after the explosion and starts to burn. Now, remember, there are firemen on hand. There are people there with hoses pointed directly at the roof of the house. There is no physical reason why the fire cannot be extinguished. But allegedly, Police Commissioner Gregor J. Sambor ordered the fire department to, quote, let the fire burn. Now, Gregor J. Sambor disputes that. And, I mean, I can't tell if he did or did not. It seems like the kind of thing that you would say you didn't do if you did do it or if you didn't do it. But for whatever reason, the fire is allowed to burn.
Yeah, that is definitely something someone would say if they realized how big their mistake was when they acted with emotion rather than logic.
And his thought here is, oh, well, the fire will burn. It'll force these guys out of the house. The fire and the smoke will push them out of their hiding place. This'll work out for us okay, I guess. I mean, it's not the best, but we have 500 people here with machine guns shooting at them, and that hasn't worked yet, so why not burn them out? Well, the reason why not burn them out is because number one, there are kids in the house. Now, there weren't supposed to be kids in the house. There was a plan to grab the kids as they were doing like a daily walk that they would do in the park, but apparently somebody tips them off. They don't end up out there. They're in the basement of the house. And the other reason why not, again, allegedly, and this is one that I don't know about, I couldn't find any way to be one way sure or another. When people do supposedly try to leave the house, the police are still firing on them. Allegedly. And this is the kind of thing that if you were one of the survivors would say, hey, we were trying to surrender and you shot at us, because then it makes your side look good. But it might also have been true. Maybe the police thought that they were still a threat. There is a significant fear that maybe anybody who's surrendering is only pretending to do that so they can get a drop on somebody. I am not here to judge the truth of it. I am only telling you what I know, and what I know is that almost nobody tried to leave the house. And the fire burned. And burned. And it didn't stay contained to the move house. It started to spread, because all of these houses are right next to each other.
Yeah, row houses are practically touching. Sometimes they are touching in their townhomes, but these ones were very, very close.
65 houses burned and were destroyed in this fire. 11 move members were killed, including 5 children. Only 2 survived. 1 adult, she is still alive, her name is Ramona Africa, and 1 child escaped. Everyone else was burned to death or had died already in the shootout, but the ensuing just carnage was unlike anything the city had ever seen before. Not only was it awful on the scale of, hey, you just blew up and burned to death these people who, admittedly, again, I'm not like a big proponent of what they were doing. Seems like they had a lot of problems. Burned to death after being bombed by the police. Not a great way to go. Not a good look for the government of America, who might not want to look like the bad guy when you're going up against people who say that the government ought to be abolished.
This was a really rough era for the TEA and various other agencies. It's like, you got this, you got Ruby Ridge, you got Waco, and they're all ending the same way. It's like burned down. People say that they're being shot when they try to leave. Like, there's so many similarities between all these cases.
And the thing is, I think at this point we've learned, oh, wait, you don't go in with an army and attack these places. You just, like, cut off the food and wait for them to come out. And more importantly, the decision not to put out the fire was not good. If there is a single bad idea in this episode, and I understand there are many more than one, the biggest one was allowing this fire to continue, because it burns 65 homes, and not only does it burn all of this area, but those homes were never properly rebuilt. They were rebuilt. There was a government program that came in and said, hey, we're going to make you guys whole. We will take care of you. Obviously, this was a big screw up. We told you not to take any stuff, and all of your stuff burned. And boy, here comes a house just as good as the one you had. And they put together these shoddy, leaky, ramshackled houses that had to be condemned like 2 or 3 years later because of how bad they were.
Sounds like government work.
It's a shame. There is no group in this story that comes off looking good. I would not recommend to you the actions and ideologies of John Africa and his MOVE organization, but neither could I recommend to you the strategies and ideas that led to eventually not only burning all of them to death, but also the entire neighborhood where they lived.
There are so many ways that this went wrong. Like, there wasn't a single thing that went right for these cops. if you're cops and you're firing 10,000 rounds, things have already hit the wall. Like, how can you make it worse from there? Well, Philadelphia found a way.
And we've compared this already to Waco and Ruby Ridge, right? Like, and there's an obvious similarity, but at least in Waco and Ruby Ridge, those places were relatively obscure. Like, if they did come in and drop a bomb on either one of those compounds, it's mostly just going to affect the people in those compounds. And as bad as those situations were, it didn't have the kind of collateral damage that this one had, because, you know, those guys weren't in the middle of a city.
Yeah, they're very lucky that none of these civilians around there died either. It's like, it's bad enough that you murdered 11 people for having weird religious beliefs and a sort of gun-based cult. But thankfully, they didn't get any of the neighbors.
Yes, the one saving grace is that they went to the neighbors and said, why don't you guys leave? Like, that's the one good thing the cops did, as far as I can tell in this. And I'm not anti-cop in all cases, but in this one, yeah, I think they probably did the wrong move. I think that in hindsight, was a bad idea.
Did anyone get in legal trouble for this afterwards?
Well, Ramona Africa went to prison for 7 years for her crimes that she was already supposed to be arrested for anyway. They managed to serve one warrant. But are you talking about the government? The police commissioner? The governor? Not the governor, I wouldn't imagine.
The agents, like everybody involved.
Nope. Not 1 year of prison served, not $1 in fines paid, although taxpayer money paid to rebuild the houses. There was a condemnation. The commission that was assigned to investigate this said, yep, y'all did it wrong. And beyond that, there were no legal consequences. Many people did end up resigning from their jobs, and Mayor Wilson Goode was not reelected the next year. So there was fallout, but if you're talking about legal consequences where somebody goes to jail, no, there was not any of that.
That is insane.
I'm not a lawyer. I don't know that I could recommend one way or the other what ought to have been done, but it sure does feel like something should have happened to somebody.
Yeah. Somebody calling the shots. It's just someone got inconvenienced in having to find a new job, and that's the worst that happened to them.
I mean, you know, you ruin your name up with something like this, I would imagine. But anyway, that is it. That is all I have for this episode of Bad Ideas. And it could be the last episode of Bad Ideas. So we thank you for listening and watching if you're over on YouTube. If you are subscribed already, we thank you for having been a subscriber. If you are not subscribed, well, take a chance. Maybe we'll make some more in the future. But for right now, our life circumstances are changing, which means we will not be able to make these on as regular a basis as we have been.
Yeah, no promises on things going forward. We're going to try some things. We're going to try to put out some videos, especially in the coming month before my job fully changes. But we just want to thank you guys again for being so great and for suggesting so many ideas and for being just generally awesome. We really enjoyed this ride.
Yes, and I, in particular, enjoyed the opportunity to learn so many things that I had not been aware of before. I know I've talked about this in many episodes, and I hope that it doesn't sound cliche, because it's so... I don't know, it's been so fulfilling to get to dig into these stories that I had no idea even existed, and you go through and find these characters and forces that you wouldn't have considered acting in the way that they acted. I feel, if nothing else has been gained from this, I feel that I have expanded my understanding of the world by a significant margin in this. And that
Definitely
is no great loss.
Yeah. And if you guys want to keep in contact, you want to say anything, hit us up at badideasshow@gmail.com. I'm sure I'll be keeping an eye out on that for a little bit. So thank you very much for being a part of this, and hopefully we will see you in the future.
Have a good one, guys.
Bye.